Right now, across the globe, we are, well, we're essentially deliberately failing millions of children in subjects like math and science.
Yeah, on a massive scale.
And we aren't failing them because they're incapable of learning the material. I mean, we're failing them because they couldn't learn it by, like, a randomly assigned Tuesday in November.
Right. The arbitrary deadlines.
Exactly. We have basically decided to treat human intelligence like a carton of milk with a strict expiration date. You know,
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
if you don't grasp fractions by the time you're exactly 10 years and 4 months old, the system just stamps you as defective, throws you out, and moves on to the next batch.
It really is a profound structural flaw. And, it's one we rarely question because we are also deeply conditioned by it.
Totally.
We operate under this bizarre, unspoken consensus that chronological age and cognitive development are just like perfectly synchronized. But it's really an administrative convenience masquerading as an educational philosophy.
Exactly. We just assume that because a child has, orbited the sun exactly 10 times, their prefrontal cortex is magically primed for long division.
Right.
And that their social development is perfectly calibrated to sit completely still for 45 minutes straight.
Right.
And when the reality of human neurodiversity collides with that rigid calendar,
It's the student who takes the blame.
yes, it's never the calendar's fault.
Yeah.
But today, we're looking at a radical proposal to throw that clock entirely out the window.
Which is so refreshing to think about.
It really is. We are exploring a complete reimagining of the education system, one designed from the ground up to completely eliminate time constraints. We're going to dive into an incredibly compelling audio recording from a broadcast called Squalor FM.
And honestly, the perspective of our source material is what makes this so uniquely valuable for us to look at today.
Oh, for sure. It's not the usual academic stuff.
Exactly. This isn't coming from some detached think tank or purely theoretical academic paper. The speaker is a self-proclaimed obsessive lifelong learner.
Right.
We are talking about someone with 27 solid years of conscious, documented study experience across physical classrooms, online university platforms, global institutions, the works.
That is just a staggering amount of time in the system.
It really is. Furthermore, they've navigated the realities of raising 3 children who have gone completely through the higher education system themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, so they have essentially lived in the engine room of the modern educational apparatus for 3 decades.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start, because the way the speaker frames their own 27 years of learning is just fascinating.
It really reframes the whole concept of being a student.
It does. They actually mention reading a news story about someone else, like another extreme student who had spent 33 years just racking up formal degrees.
Taking every exam imaginable.
Right, collecting these academic trophies. And our source's reaction wasn't jealousy. It was almost like this bemused realization. They note that their own 27 years haven't been about hunting for shiny diplomas at all.
No, they use a very specific term for what they're doing.
Yes, competence reinforcement.
And that distinction between competence reinforcement and formal merit accumulation, well, that's the bedrock of their entire argument.
How so?
The speaker points out that continuously reinforcing your actual usable competence makes you vastly more adaptable. You become more valuable in a real-world workplace and much more capable of solving novel problems.
Right, because you actually know how to do the thing.
Exactly. But society doesn't have an easy way to measure or reward that quiet, messy, non-linear process of competence reinforcement.
Society just wants a piece of paper with a date and a stamp on it.
Precisely. The stamp is easy for an HR department to categorize.
The speaker even mentions burning through 90% of their possible student financial aid,
Yeah.
the CSN system in Sweden specifically.
Which is a huge commitment.
Oh, absolutely. And not just to pay for the studies themselves, but simply to survive the prolonged, intensive process of actual learning. It highlights this massive societal friction. Like, we claim we want a highly skilled, competent population, but we only financially and socially reward the final formalized certification.
The journey itself is treated like an annoying prerequisite.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core premise proposed in the recording. Having identified this massive disconnect between how humans actually learn and how institutions demand they perform, the speaker proposes a structural alternative.
The floating school.
Yes, or in Swedish, flytande disco.
Right. And the basic concept here is that classes, technically speaking, never end until mastery is achieved.
Which sounds wild at first.
It does. It fundamentally severs the link between what age you are and what grade level of material you're allowed to study.
But going from I believe in lifelong learning, to let's completely abolish the concept of school years from grades 1 through 9. That is a massive conceptual leap.
Huge.
What are the actual mechanical flaws in our current system that drive the source to such an extreme solution?
Well, to understand the necessity of the floating school, you really have to look at the psychological damage inflicted by the rigid temporal boundaries of traditional schooling.
Okay.
The source begins by painting a very grounded picture of early childhood. Children, by their very nature, are restless.
Very much so.
Right. They are imaginative, kinetic, and driven by this boundless energy to play and explore their immediate physical environment.
Right.
And this isn't pathology. You don't need a medical diagnosis to explain it. It is the default evolutionary state of a young human brain trying to map the world.
But the current system treats that default state as an obstacle that needs to be suppressed.
Exactly.
The speaker gives this brilliant, almost tragic everyday example. Imagine a kid who is sitting at a desk and they are finally genuinely grasping a math concept. The gears are turning.
You're in the zone.
Yeah. Or maybe they're just finally getting into the social rhythm of the classroom. And then, abruptly, a bell rings.
Time's up.
Right. It's recess. Time for the next segment of the factory line. So they run outside, they engage their physical bodies, they start establishing social hierarchies on the playground, they invent a game, they are in the middle of a really complex peer-to-peer negotiation.
And the bell rings again.
Exactly. And they are immediately dragged back inside, forced to sit completely still, and told to cognitively pivot to religion or social studies.
The source actually gives voice to the children's internal monologue here, which I loved.
Oh, what was it?
It's essentially, good Lord, we didn't even have time to start playing.
Wow, yeah.
It just feels completely absurd to the kids.
And if we're honest, it sounds absurd to adults, too. I mean, if you're deep into a complex financial spreadsheet at work, and your boss rings a bell and says, stop immediately, you must now go play table tennis for 15 minutes.
That would be maddening.
Right. And then they say, now you must immediately return and write a creative marketing essay. Your brain would just revolt.
Absolutely. We call it context switching in the corporate world, and we know it destroys productivity.
So why do we assume a 7-year-old's brain is better at it than a 30-year-old's?
Well, we don't assume they are better at it. We just don't care, because the schedule isn't designed for the brain.
Oof.
If we trace this back historically, the rigid bell schedule of the traditional school system wasn't built on neurodevelopmental research.
Not at all.
It was largely modeled during the Industrial Revolution to train a future workforce in factory floor compliance. The primary lesson isn't math or social studies. The primary lesson is obedience to the clock.
Wow. That makes total sense, though.
Yeah.
You are training the child that their internal state of focus or curiosity is completely irrelevant compared to the external mandate of the schedule.
Yes.
But the critique in the source material goes even deeper than just the frustration of a disrupted schedule. They bring up this fascinating piece of older research regarding imagination and the crushing weight of group conformity.
Ah, yes, the drawing example.
Yeah, tell me about that.
This is where we transition from looking at logistical frustration to looking at actual cognitive suppression. The speaker notes that up until about the 3rd grade, children tend to draw highly imaginative, wild, unique pictures.
Like purple skies and giant cats.
Exactly. They're drawing purely from their own internal world, totally unbothered by external metrics of realism.
But then something happens between the 3rd and 4th grade, right?
What's fascinating here is that the speaker points out if one kid draws a standard realistic flower and the class, or more importantly, the teacher praises that flower, a massive shift occurs.
The imagination just vanishes from the room.
Completely. Suddenly, every single child just starts drawing that exact same flower.
Because they want to fit in. They want that validation.
Exactly. If we look at the psychological mechanism behind this, it perfectly aligns with developmental psychology. Around the age of 8 or 9, a child's cognitive framework shifts dramatically.
From what to what?
From egocentrism, where they are the center of their own universe, to peer-centric socialization. They become hyper-aware of social hierarchies, external judgment, and conformity.
Which is a natural developmental stage.
It is. But the traditional school environment, with its standardized grading and public grouping by age, essentially weaponizes this developmental stage. It enforces conformity as a survival mechanism.
So the educational system inherently prioritizes group conformity over natural intellectual curiosity.
Yes.
Now, to be fair to the source, they don't claim conformity is entirely evil. They do acknowledge that learning to read a room, understanding group dynamics, and knowing how to collaborate are absolutely vital skills for the modern workplace.
Of course, you cannot function in a complex global economy if you operate purely as an uncooperative individualist.
Right.
The problem isn't that socialization happens. The problem is that socialization and conformity are intrinsically tied to strict, high-stakes time limits for acquiring hard knowledge.
It's the combination of the two that is lethal to learning. Because if the goal is to get everyone to draw the exact same flower at the exact same time before the bell rings, you are actively destroying two distinct groups of learners.
Right, you're hurting the slower learners and the faster ones.
Yes, you are leaving behind the kids who possess the capacity to draw the flower perfectly, but simply need 20 more minutes to figure out the mechanics of the pencil.
Hmm.
And you are holding back the kids who figured out the flower in 2 minutes and now desperately want to draw an entire complex ecosystem, but aren't allowed to because it's not in the day's lesson plan.
Exactly. The system forces a regression to the mean. It demands average pacing over deep understanding.
It makes me think of an assembly line at a car manufacturing plant.
Yeah,
The conveyor belt moves at one constant non-negotiable speed.
right.
It moves whether you, the worker on the line, have successfully bolted the car door on or not. If the buzzer sounds and you only got 2 out of 4 bolts in, the line doesn't care. The car is moving to the paint shop.
And the paint shop isn't going to fix the door.
No, they are just going to spray paint right over the dangling hinges. If we apply that to education, what is the psychological toll of that conveyor belt moving forward while the student is left holding the bolts?
What you're describing is the architecture of cumulative deficit.
Cumulative deficit.
Yeah. When the school year ends, the calendar dictates that the conveyor belt must move. You either got the foundational math or you didn't.
Right.
If you didn't, the system doesn't pause to let you finish the cognitive work. You are forced to carry that deficit into the next academic year.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. So now you have a student trying to build complex algebra on top of a shaky, incomplete foundation of basic multiplication.
It's cognitive structural failure.
Precisely. And the source states very clearly that this exact mechanism is why students eventually graduate or completely fall out of the system with failing grades in core subjects like math, language, and civics.
Wow.
It isn't a lack of intelligence. It is a cumulative manufactured deficit.
And this doesn't just destroy the student's self-esteem and future prospects, right?
No, the speaker argues it becomes a massive, tangible burden on society as a whole.
Because society has to financially and socially support a population that the educational system deliberately left structurally unsound.
Exactly.
Which perfectly tees up the radical solution at the heart of this deep dive. If the ticking clock is the enemy of actual competence, how do you build a school without one?
This is where it gets really fun.
Yeah, the source introduces their concept using one of the best pop culture analogies imaginable, the Hotel California model of mastery.
You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Exactly. The concept of never-ending classes. Now, for anyone listening, we obviously don't mean students are locked in a subterranean dungeon with a math textbook until they're 50.
No.
What the source means is that the class itself, the module of learning, does not have a firm expiration date tied to the month of June. You are in the class until you actually learn the material.
Right.
To really illustrate how this functions, the source walks us through a hypothetical student. Let's introduce you to Callie.
Callie is a brilliant hypothetical because he represents the reality of the spiky profile.
What exactly is a spiky profile?
In developmental psychology and cognitive science, a spiky profile refers to an individual who has extreme peaks of high ability in certain areas, paired with deep valleys of struggle in others.
Okay, that makes sense.
The traditional system demands a flat profile, basically average competence across the board. But Callie is spiky. He is a linguistic prodigy.
And when we say prodigy, we mean the source paints him as an absolute sponge for languages.
Right.
By the 3rd grade, chronologically, Callie speaks his native Swedish. He has already mastered English. He has picked up conversational Chinese just from sitting in his room watching anime.
Which is amazing.
And he's functional in French. If you put Callie in a traditional 3rd grade language arts class, it is tantamount to psychological torture. He is going to be profoundly, aggressively bored.
But here is the critical valley in his spiky profile.
Yeah.
Calais is terrible at math. The source outlines that Calais grasps basic addition, subtraction, and simple division. But when he hits the larger multi-digit multiplications required by the standard 4th grade curriculum, he hits an absolute brick wall.
It's just too much for him at that age.
Exactly. The cognitive load is simply too high for his current developmental state in that specific domain. Now, the tragedy here is that Kaylee's ultimate dream is to become a doctor.
Oh, wow. And under the current assembly line model, that dream is actively being killed before he even hits puberty.
Yes.
Because that accumulating math deficit will eventually keep him out of the necessary advanced science and medical programs.
And the source anticipates the standard societal response here. The traditional system's answer is to outsource the failure.
Meaning the parents.
Right. The teacher will call his parents in and say, Kaylee is falling behind the conveyor belt. You need to tutor him at home.
But the source makes a very grounded socioeconomic point here, right? We do not live in the 1950s.
Exactly. Both parents are likely working full-time jobs. They are exhausted. They do not have the time, the emotional energy, or frankly, the pedagogical expertise to sit down at the kitchen table and effectively teach fourth-grade multiplication methods, especially methods that have likely changed since they were in school.
So the parents fail, Kali fails, and the school washes its hands of him because the calendar year is up.
It's a lose-lose.
Kali gets an F in math, his self-work plummets, and meanwhile, he spends hours every week sitting in a language class he mastered 3 years ago, completely checked out. That is the reality for thousands of kids.
It really is.
Well, let's transport Kala into the floating school, the Flytan Scola. How does this Hotel California model actually change his daily life?
In the floating school, we completely sever the umbilical cord between a student's chronological age and their grade placement.
Okay.
The administration looks at Kala's profile. They recognize his extreme linguistic competence. So, depending on his exact tested proficiency, Kal is physically removed from the third-grade language class and placed straight into a ninth-grade language module. He is interacting with complex, high-level material that finally challenges him.
Okay, so he's a 9-year-old taking high school level French. But what about the math? Does he just ignore it?
Not at all. He stays in the foundational math module. He stays there until he truly masters the multi-digit multiplication.
Even if he gets older?
Yes. Even if his physical age advances to 10, 11, or 12, his math placement does not artificially advance until the competence is genuinely achieved. The class is never ending in the sense that the systemic opportunity to learn it never expires.
And he is never punished for needing more time.
Exactly.
Okay, this is where I need to push back on the premise a little bit.
Yeah.
Because this sounds incredibly utopian. If we remove the deadline, if there is no threat of a failing grade in June, what is forcing Kyle to actually engage with the math?
That's the big question.
Doesn't this just incentivize procrastination? How does the removal of time limits actually impact long-term retention?
That is the core anxiety everyone has when discussing mastery-based learning. We assume humans only learn under threat, but the source dives deep into the psychology of retention, arguing that true integrated learning at its biological core shouldn't hurt.
Right. The speaker makes a point that expanding your understanding of the world, learning about geopolitics, or discovering how a combustion engine works, that process doesn't inherently cause pain.
Exactly.
What does cause psychological pain is being forced to study abstract concepts you don't understand, completely devoid of context, on a strict, unforgiving deadline where failure results in public humiliation.
The stress response is the absolute enemy of neuroplasticity.
Oh, how so?
When a student is terrified of an impending Friday deadline for a subject they don't grasp, their brain is flooded with cortisol. The amygdala goes into fight or flight mode.
Oh, okay.
And neurologically speaking, when the amygdala is highly active, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex problem solving, logic, and long-term memory encoding, is essentially bypassed.
So you're literally blocking the learning process.
Yes, you literally cannot force long-term retention in a state of high anxiety. You can force short-term cramming, sure, which evaporates a week later, but you cannot force true competence.
And to anchor this in a visceral reality, the speaker uses an absolutely brilliant analogy to explain the futility of forcing retention on a deadline. The boiled egg.
I love this part.
I love this so much because it perfectly captures the absurdity of the traditional model.
It is arguably the most powerful metaphor in the entire audio recording. It perfectly illustrates the thermodynamics of learning.
The premise is simple. You cannot take a raw egg, drop it into a pot of boiling water, Look at your watch and pull it out after exactly 30 seconds, just because your lesson plan says time is up.
Right.
You can't pull it out and expect it to be a hard-boiled egg.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how loud the teacher yells at the egg. It doesn't matter if the principal gives the egg an F and threatens to hold it back a year.
Right, because applying more heat or more pressure doesn't magically speed up the chemical reaction of the egg proteins coagulating. If you apply too much heat too fast, you don't get a faster boiled egg. You just crack the shell and ruin the egg entirely. You have to work with the natural thermodynamics of the object.
The source explicitly says life will find a way, but warns that you cannot create artificial rules that deviate from natural capacity and expect success.
It's just impossible.
You can no more legislate that an egg boils faster than you can pass a law dictating that a human brain must form the necessary neural pathways for complex multiplication by the second Tuesday of November.
Exactly. And the source transitions from this biological metaphor of the egg into a highly technical personal anecdote about skill acquisition. And I think it fundamentally exposes the flaws in how we structure curriculum.
They talk about a hypothetical 3-year motor building class.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this story isn't just about time. It's about the fundamental mechanics of how different brains encode information.
Right. The speaker contrasts the traditional educational approach with their own highly specific tactile learning style.
So imagine you sign up for this 3-year class to learn how to build a motor. Under the traditional top-down educational method, you walk in on day 1, the teacher welcomes you, and they open a textbook to page 1.
Okay.
On page 1 is a diagram of a single specific screw. And for the next 2 weeks, the entire class does a deep dive into this one screw.
2 weeks on a screw.
2 weeks. You learn how the threads are machined, the tensile strength of the metal, and what industries use it. And our speaker notes that in this environment, their brain just completely shuts down.
Total disengagement.
Total. Their internal monologue is screaming, "It's just a screw! Who hasn't seen a screw? To what end are we doing this? When do we actually see the motor?"
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if we look at this through the lens of cognitive load, the traditional method is demanding abstract sequential memorization.
Right.
The teacher is asking the student to hold on to the discrete properties of a screw for months, trusting that eventually it will make sense when attached to a motor they haven't yet seen.
Which is so hard.
For a mind that needs context, what we call top-down processors, this is agonizing.
So the speaker outlines their own reverse method. Instead of starting with a 2-week lecture on a piece of hardware, the speaker wants to walk into a room where a fully built, functioning motor is sitting right there on the table.
Start with the whole thing.
Yes. They want to take the entire thing apart with their own hands. As they dismantle it, they want to draw a physical blueprint.
Okay.
Every time they extract a screw, they map exactly where it goes. They physically categorize the pieces into numbered boxes, and they actively construct what they call a visual sequence memory.
That phrase, visual sequence memory, is vital.
Why is that?
It's an entirely different cognitive pathway. The traditional method relies on semantic memory recalling facts from a book.
Right.
The speaker's method relies on episodic and spatial memory, remembering where things are and how they physically relate to one another in space. And more importantly, the speaker emphasizes that this method embraces learning by failing.
Yes. They explicitly say they want the freedom to try inserting a screw made of the wrong metal to see what happens when it strips or fails under pressure.
Exact.
That tactile failure is the lesson. The failure encodes the knowledge infinitely deeper than reading a warning in a textbook.
But here is the critical systemic issue.
Yeah.
You cannot learn by failing if the system treats failure as a terminal offense.
Oh, that's a great point.
In the traditional class, if you test the wrong screw and it breaks, you lose points, your grade drops, and you might fail the module entirely.
Right, so you're terrified to try.
The system punishes the exact exploratory mechanism that solidifies deep comprehension.
Which brings us back to Callie and the floating school. The beauty of this model is that it inherently accommodates both the speed and the style of learning.
It does.
Because Callie has already checked the boxes for multiple language requirements, those entire subjects are wiped from his daily schedule. That frees up a massive amount of cognitive bandwidth and sheer physical energy.
The source makes a really compelling point about resource allocation here.
What do they say?
Well, when you reduce the total volume of completely disparate subjects a child is forced to juggle every day, they can redirect all of their cognitive force toward their weakest points.
That makes total sense.
Kelly doesn't have to spend a decade languishing in the same math class because he now has The dedicated time, the mental clarity, and the freedom from judgment to tackle that multiplication block using whatever method works for him.
Whether that's the traditional textbook or reverse engineering a visual sequence memory.
Exactly.
Okay, I am entirely sold on how this benefits the student. It sounds incredible. But let's look at the other side of the equation. We cannot ignore the people tasked with executing this vision.
The teachers.
Yes. What does this mean for the educators? Because if you tell me that a teacher is now going to manage a classroom where age doesn't dictate placement, I'm immediately picturing absolute administrative chaos.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
How do teachers manage a floating school without losing their minds?
It's a completely valid concern. If you attempt to force the floating school concept into the existing architectural and administrative infrastructure of a modern public school, it would collapse in a week.
I believe that.
But the source anticipates this. They outline a very specific, deliberate transition phase. It doesn't happen overnight.
How does it start?
It begins with an intensive first year dedicated almost entirely to base skill assessments.
Meaning you don't just open the doors and let the kids wander into whatever room they want.
No, absolutely not. You rigorously test the entire student body to map exactly where their foundations are solid and exactly where the structural cracks are hiding.
So you get real data.
Precisely. The data becomes granular and actionable. Teachers are provided with crystal clear, objective information on precisely which microskills require reinforcement for each individual student.
That's amazing for a teacher.
It removes the terrifying guesswork of looking at 30 kids and wondering who is actually following the lesson. So once the assessment phase is complete, imagine the new classroom dynamic. A teacher might be assigned to oversee foundational math, Module 3, multi-digit multiplication. But the students walking through the door to take that module aren't a homogeneous group of 9-year-olds.
Right.
The room might contain a brilliant 7-year-old math prodigy sitting next to our friend Kaylee, the linguistic genius who is chronologically 10, sitting next to a 14-year-old who has severe dyscalculia and needs intense specialized repetition.
All right, this is where I really have to push back on the source.
Go ahead.
The utopian vision is hitting a wall of social reality here. You are putting a 14-year-old teenager in the exact same academic tier as a 7-year-old. Teenagers are brutally status conscious.
Sure.
The social humiliation for that 14-year-old boy sitting in a room with a bunch of second graders learning multiplication would be absolutely devastating. He wouldn't learn. He would shut down completely out of shame. How does the source or this model possibly justify or handle that social dynamic?
That is the most common critique of mixed-stage mastery models. But you have to realize that the shame you were describing is an artifact of the current system.
What do you mean?
Why is it humiliating for a 14-year-old to be bad at math? Because the current system explicitly dictates that all 14-year-olds must be good at algebra, and if you aren't, you are defective. The floating school dismantles that baseline assumption entirely.
You're saying that if everyone is on a uniquely tailored timeline, the stigma of being behind evaporates because there is no universal conveyor belt to be behind on.
Exactly. The source introduces a fascinating Swedish term here, of ranking.
Of ranking. Okay, what does that translate to?
It roughly translates to downgrading, ranking down, or essentially failing out of your peer group.
Okay.
In the traditional system, of ranking is a public, highly visible execution of a student's social standing. But the source argues that in a fully realized floating school, of ranking becomes an entirely uninteresting, irrelevant concept.
Because everyone is fundamentally operating on their own individual track.
Yeah.
The speaker mentions that students would largely be operating through individualized digital devices or highly tailored analog systems. You are focused on your own progression bar, not the age of the person sitting next to you.
And let's look at the massive advantage this structure provides to the teacher.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
You mentioned earlier that managing this sounds like chaos. The source actually flips that assumption completely upside down. Think about what we demand of an elementary school teacher right now.
It's a lot.
We ask them to be a master of math for 40 minutes, then instantly pivot to being a master of literature, then a master of historical geography, then a master of conflict resolution on the playground.
It is a state of perpetual, exhausting context switching.
Ah.
So by siloing the modules by subject mastery rather than age group, the teacher gets to specialize.
Yes.
If I'm the teacher running the foundational math module, I don't have to worry about prepping a history lesson for the afternoon.
Precisely. And Here is the real pedagogical magic of the floating school. Because the teacher is hyper-focused on one specific conceptual hurdle, say, the leap from addition to multiplication.
Yeah.
And because they are watching a vast diversity of ages, temperaments, and cognitive styles attempt to clear that exact same hurdle, the teacher's role elevates.
They become true specialists.
They are no longer just an orator delivering a standardized script. They become a master observer of cognitive acquisition. They become expert pattern recognizers.
They start to see how the human brain learns rather than just grading whether it did.
Exactly.
They can observe the distinct difference between how the anxious 14-year-old processes the math versus how the hyperactive 7-year-old attacks it.
Yes. They build an internal, intuitive database of pedagogical interventions. They might think, oh, you're getting stuck on the carryover in this equation. I saw a 10-year-old with a similar spiky profile last week. Let's try the visual sequence memory method on you.
Wow. The expertise of the teacher deepens exponentially.
It does. And the source emphasizes that this shift shouldn't just be expected as charity. The speaker argues forcefully that teachers who pioneer this, the educators who volunteer to step off the traditional conveyor belt and adapt to these evidence-based, mastery-centric methods,
They should be compensated.
it should be formally and significantly rewarded. They specifically state that this transition should be heavily incentivized across the Nordic countries and the broader EU.
It requires a systemic, financial, and cultural reward for educators willing to map the actual terrain of human learning rather than just policing the clock.
Absolutely.
It's an incredibly ambitious vision. And it brings me to a specific type of student. If you're listening to this and you were the kid who simply could not sit still, the one who is constantly labeled distracted, disruptive, or messy,
Yes.
this next part completely rewrites the narrative of your childhood. How does the floating school save the truly restless student? The ones the source refers to as stukiga.
To understand the salvation, we first have to understand the suffering. Early in the audio recording, the speaker shares a seemingly unrelated personal anecdote.
Oh, about the bike ride.
Yeah. They mention going for a bike ride to run a short errand and returning completely out of breath, exhausted.
And they compare the feeling of this minor physical task to running a marathon, simply because they are carrying extra physical weight and struggle with exertion.
Right. They describe a massive startup distance, a profound friction required just to get the momentum going.
It's an incredibly vulnerable admission, but it functions as a profound metaphor for executive dysfunction and the restless student.
Exactly. For a student with ADHD, or just a naturally restless disposition, simply sitting in the hard plastic chair, opening the textbook to the correct page, and forcing their eyes to track the text feels like running a cognitive marathon.
Yeah.
The startup cost, the friction required to initiate the task, is astronomically high due to how their brain regulates dopamine and task salience.
And what does the traditional school system do to that kid?
It tortures them.
It rings a bell every 45 minutes and forces them to stop, switch rooms, switch subjects, and pay that massive startup cost all over again 6 times a day.
Yeah.
And when they inevitably fail to initiate the task fast enough, the system tells them they are broken. Every single day is a barrage of micro-failures.
It is a systemic destruction of their locus of control. But as we discussed with the concept of ranking, the floating school removes the arbitrary daily deadlines, which removes the constant public shame of failure.
However, a very valid question arises here, which I kind of hinted at earlier.
Okay.
If there are no deadlines and no threat of failing a grade, doesn't the restless kid just sit in the back of the room and play video games for 5 years? Where is the motivation? If I know I can't fail, what's stopping me from doing absolutely nothing?
This is where the psychology of the floating school proves its brilliance. It removes the arbitrary negative time limits, but it replaces them with something the source calls positive pressure.
Positive pressure.
Okay.
Okay, explain the mechanism behind that. How is pressure positive?
Think about it like a skill tree in a complex video game. In a video game, nobody forces you to fight the boss on a specific day. You can wander the forest indefinitely.
Right.
But the game exerts positive pressure. You absolutely know that you cannot unlock the new map, you cannot get the upgraded armor, and you cannot progress the story until you acquire the necessary skills to beat that specific boss.
So the rule is absolute, but the timeline is entirely up to you.
Oh, exactly.
Wow. So if we apply that tech tree logic to education.
In the current system, the pressure is negative and external. learn this math by Friday or I will give you an F and you will be punished.
Right.
In the floating school, the pressure is positive, internal, and goal-oriented. The student is told with absolute clarity, you cannot move on to the specialized vocational training you want, you cannot enter the advanced high school modules, and ultimately you cannot access the high salary careers until you verify competence in this specific foundational math module.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
Isn't it?
You are taking a student who feels entirely victimized by the calendar and handing them complete ownership of their future.
Yes.
Instead of feeling defeated and sinking into learned helplessness because they got an F in June, they realize they are entirely in control.
Exactly. The student knows they are exactly 2, 3, or maybe 6 years closer to a higher salary. The absolute moment they decide to sit down and pay the startup costs to do the work.
Right.
It replaces the despair of a permanent, unchangeable failing grade with the motivating certainty of an inevitable self-paced goal.
That's powerful.
It says to the restless student, take all the time you need, wander the map, but the only way to the next level is through the work. It rebuilds their internal locus of control.
That is incredibly empowering. It treats the student like an autonomous human being rather than a defective product.
Which is how it should be.
Now, if we zoom out from Kala and we zoom out from the restless students, we have to look at the macroeconomic reality.
Right. The big picture.
Yeah, what happens to a nation that actually adopts the floating school? We're talking about fundamentally dismantling the way we transition youth into adulthood and the workforce.
The societal and economic impacts are arguably the most compelling part of the source's entire manifesto.
Right.
Think about the massive bottleneck we currently have in society regarding high school and university admissions. It is a hyper-competitive, anxiety-inducing sorting mechanism.
Oh, it's brutal.
And what is it actually sorting for? It's largely sorting based on how well a student adhered to the temporal deadlines of primary education, using GPA as a proxy metric for intelligence.
Right. The university looks at the transcript and says, well, they got a B+ in 10th grade math, which means they were mostly competent on the days the tests were administered.
Exactly. It's a proxy. It's guessing.
And the source argues that if you implement a true mastery-based system, if a student is literally not allowed to leave the foundational school until they have successfully, demonstrably achieved full competence in all core subjects.
You completely alter the entry barriers for higher education.
Because the prerequisite for university is no longer a guessed grade point average. The prerequisite is verified, undeniable competence.
Yes. The university doesn't have to guess if the incoming freshman can handle the reading load or the foundational math.
They know they can.
Right, because the student wouldn't possess the digital clearance to apply if they hadn't already mastered it.
Exactly. The friction of admissions drops significantly. It simply becomes a matter of logistical resource management.
Plugging fully competent students into open educational slots as they become available, rather than artificially ranking them based on who learned it fastest.
But the ripple effects go far beyond just making university admissions less stressful.
Yeah.
We are talking about a fundamental shift in national economic competitiveness.
Absolutely.
The source specifically mentions that ensuring this level of true competence across the entire population raises the country's overall merit value.
Yes. From a macroeconomic perspective, human capital is the ultimate driver of innovation and economic stability. Under the traditional conveyor belt system, a nation is quietly graduating thousands of students every year with severe hidden deficits in literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking.
And those deficits bleed into the workforce.
Exactly, causing inefficiencies, accidents, and a massive need for corporate retraining.
Right.
When a nation adopts the floating school and stops graduating students with structural deficits, the baseline competence of the entire national workforce skyrockets.
The source actually suggests that citizens produced by a system like this become highly sought after globally.
They do, because a company hiring a graduate from the system isn't taking a gamble on a GPA, they are hiring verified mastery.
Right.
The competence of the nation literally becomes a tangible export. You are generating immense global value and income for the country because your workforce is undeniably skilled, deeply resilient, and knows how to learn independently rather than just being superficially certificated.
So what does this all mean? When we look at all these puzzle pieces we've laid out on the table today, the ticking clock of the industrial school bell, the thermodynamics of the boiled egg, Kali's spiky profile.
The visual sequence memory of the motor builder.
Yes, exactly. The teacher transformed into a pattern recognizer, and ultimately the macroeconomic explosion of national merit value. What is the grand unifying takeaway from this 27-year learner?
The ultimate synthesis of the source's argument is a profound observation about the nature of human progress.
Hmm.
If a society wants to make a genuine evolutionary leap into the future, it cannot simply mandate competence through legislation. You cannot pass a law that says you must learn complex geopolitics by tomorrow.
No.
True, historical, evidence-based knowledge transfer requires the bravery to abandon the artificial clock. We have to build systems that recognize human brains are not standardized assembly line products,
They are organic, diverse, incredibly complex ecosystems.
capable of astounding feats, but only if we give them the right environment, the right positive pressure, and the exact amount of time they individually require.
It is a brilliantly optimistic vision of what human beings are capable of when we stop treating them like factory parts.
It really is.
To wrap up our deep dive today, we have traveled an immense conceptual distance. We started by examining the sheer cognitive whiplash of the school bell interrupting a child's natural play.
Right.
We diagnosed the failures of the conveyor belt through Kalati, the linguistic genius drowning in a fourth-grade math class,
We explored the deep neurobiology of why you cannot rush a boiling egg.
and why tactile failure is vastly superior to staring at a picture of a screw. We completely reimagined the exhausted teacher as an empowered, specialized expert in cognitive acquisition.
And ultimately, we saw how replacing the shame of the clock with the positive pressure of a video game skill tree could elevate the economic power of an entire nation. This raises an important question,
Yeah.
one that extends far beyond the administrative walls of any first through ninth grade classroom.
Exactly. Because whether you are 7 years old or 70 years old, you are constantly interacting with systems that demand you perform on a schedule. And we want to leave you, the listener, with something to chew on. Something that takes the core philosophy of the floating school and applies it directly to your life right now.
I love this.
If a truly mastery-based education system removes arbitrary time limits and replaces the anxiety of failure with the quiet, positive pressure of inevitable competence.
How would adopting that mindset change the way you approach your own professional development or adult learning today?
Exactly. If you fundamentally allowed yourself to be a work in progress, without a ticking clock or an impending deadline dictating your self-worth, what complex, intimidating subject would you finally give yourself permission to master?
It's a question well worth spending some real time on, at your own pace.
Thank you for diving deep with us today. It has been an absolute privilege unpacking this radical vision of a world without educational expiration dates. Keep questioning the invisible clocks in your own life, keep exploring your own spiky profile, and never stop learning.